someone say slot 1 build off? But first, some history. Since the days of the 386, cache memory has been used to mitigate performance discrepancies between the CPU and the RAM. Residing on the motherboard, cache RAM provided significant improvements in performance. As manufacturing processes were refined, it became possible to fit a very small amount of cache on the CPU silicon itself, such as with the 486. This was named Level 1 cache, and although small, it could be accessed at the same speed as the CPU, which by now used a multiplier to perform instructions at higher frequencies. A larger amount remained on the motherboard, now called Level 2 cache, but which ran at the same frequency as the system bus. This format continued into the Pentium era with further improvements to manufacturing and clock speeds. Pipeline burst cache was introduced to keep pace with these advancements, but it still only ran as fast as the motherboard. With the introduction of the Pentium Pro, it had become possible to include Level 2 cache not on the CPU itself, but in the same package, allowing it to run at the same clock speed as the CPU. This was expensive, however, and a flaw in either the CPU or the cache would waste both, which affected how many CPUs could be reliably produced. The Slot 1 package was introduced in May 1997 to solve this problem by placing the CPU and cache on a dedicated PCB together, earning it the name backside cache, or arse cache. Although it only ran at half the frequency of the CPU, this was still faster than the motherboard clock, and so began the era of slotted CPUs, until CPU makers could develop technology to place larger cache on the CPU silicon itself. Hi, I'm the Brassic Gamer, and today we're going to party like it's 1999. I say party, I mean we're going to build a computer, like an old one. You can't build a computer without a case, so this is the only one I really have from that era. It's from Tiny, which was a local firm in the UK, and they built computers in the mid-90s PC boom. This particular one is 1995-96, is a bit beat up because it's been in someone's loft, but it is perfect for this era. Because of the ATX form factor shielding on the back, and it's got plenty of space inside. It also has an error-correct CD-ROM and a floppy drive and a power supply already installed. Next up, motherboards. So for a person who's never actually built a Slot 1 system, I seem to have quite a few. We've got these two over here which are almost identical, but separated by chipset. So you've got the Supermicro P6 SLA and P6 SBA. This one has a BX chipset, this one has an LX chipset, which was its predecessor. So it's really a question of what CPU I'm going to go with here. These two are kind of the same. This is a QDI Legend 5, and that uses the same chipset, so these two are basically identical. I could either go for early Pentium 2, 200, 300 megahertz, or we could go for a faster Pentium 2 with this one, or we could push the boat out and go for a Pentium 3. This board is a standard MSI job. You've got only 2 slots for RAM, obviously 1 ISA slot, 3 PCI slots, but this does support AGB2, so that's 4x speed. But we do have integrated sound and a game port as well, so that kind of helps. Does it though? I mean, this is a Creative 1373, which is an Ensoniq chipset with the terrible FM synthesis, but good wavetable. And to be honest, this is going to be a wavetable era machine. So, let's have a look at the CPUs and maybe we'll go from there. CPUs. So this is the tricky bit because I have to choose the motherboard and the CPU that are going to work first time to save time. So we've got 3 distinct kind of eras here We start with the 266 Pentium 2, which is the Klamath core. We've got a 66 megahertz front side bus, and that is the 300 megahertz one. That thing was $2,000 when it came out, which is mental. I mean, that's what I read on one of the CPU database websites. I don't know if that's completely true or not, but apparently in July of 1997, this was $2,000. This came out a couple of months earlier and was itself the bee's knees at the time. So they would go with the Legend 5. Then you've got the Deschutes Core 350, and that one is passively cooled. And you can see that's a pretty beefy heatsink they've got there. The reason they passively cool that is because it went down to a 0.25 micron manufacturing process. That is also 100 megahertz frontside bus, as is this one and this one. They're both Katmai Pentium 3s, 550 and 600 megahertz respectively. Also 0.25 because it was based on the Deschutes core, but improved. And then finally, we've got the 850 megahertz Coppermine. That would obviously go with this one. This is the only board that can support 133 megahertz bus, but none of these CPUs support that anyway. So do I go very earliest Pentium 2, or do I go very latest slot 1 Coppermine? Well, that decision has just been made for me. There is at least one bulging cap on this motherboard, which means I'm not going to be using that today because I'm not going to be repairing anything. Screw that. I'm going to go with the Legend 5 and the 300 megahertz Klamath Pentium 2. Well, after all that, I've made an immediate change of plans, and I'm going with the Deschutes on the BX chipset because A, it's passively cooled, and B, it's got the WinBIOS. RAM. Well, we've got a real mixture here. Obviously, we want the 100 megahertz stuff, you would think, but apparently I only have one 256 meg module. Now, half a gig should be fine for this. Overkill, to be honest. But I don't like the idea of the number 384, which would be 3 times 128. So I'd rather go with 256 or 512. Got plenty of 512s in the 133 megahertz. So I guess I'll try out some 256 and see if it works. Graphics cards. So it's 1998. There's two ways we can go here. Using a dedicated GPU like... they're not GPUs, are they? So it's 1998. There are two ways we can go here. 3D card like the Rage Pro or the Intel i740. These are both very much 1998 cards, but there is another way. A Verge DX PCI interface. Why would I want one of those? Because I could use one of these. Or I could use two of these. Now, I've never actually done SLI. The reason for that is that I don't have the cable that connects the two cards together. And I'm not in the mood to make one. And this one doesn't have the same amount of RAM as that one. So I think I'm going to just stick with the Voodoo 2 combined with the S3. And then to finish off, I've got a Sound Blaster Live, which apparently can do DOS compatibility, so I've heard, and an Ethernet card. Finally, storage isn't even a question. I've got a hard drive already, which has Windows 98 installed on it, I think, and it's 20 gig. Well, there we go. Pretty neat. Fingers crossed, eh? Okay, time to test it out. Peripherals wise, we've got a Cherry keyboard. Not sure what kind of switches it uses, but it's kind of semi-clicky. We've got an optical PS2 mouse, rarest of things, and a Logitech Wingman. We have lights. We have a permanent floppy light. That's not good. Usually means the cable's around the wrong way. We've got a permanent hard drive light, which means something is misconfigured there. But we have bootage. Pentium 2, 350. Oh god, it's doing a RAM test. Let's skip that. It's absolutely silent. Apart from the beeping works, but I can't hear a single thing. I think the hard drive might not be spinning. I should be able to hear that at least. Oh yeah. Just going through this BIOS, I've never really used this extensively before, but I've just noticed it's got voltage detection as well, which is pretty impressive. So I can see that the PSU is working fine, and we've got -5 volts as well. So it's a pretty versatile system. I'm hoping this will now boot. Well, annoyingly, the drive that I hoped I could use to avoid installing Windows 98 wouldn't boot. So rather than faff about with trying to fix it, I just thought I'd reinstall Windows. Okay, we've hit a snag just as I'm about to start installing some software. It's behaving pretty erratically and just kind of turning itself off and back on again. So I'm suspecting the power supply. It was okay, and then it started doing it again. So I'm just going to swap it out. Okay, I've worked out what it is. I took the case off and immediately felt the heat. This is roasting hot. I can't even touch it longer than like a second. So passive cooling sucks in this case anyway, because there's just no airflow. There's no place to actually put a fan as such. So I might have to swap out for a later CPU. It's a bit of a shame, but at the moment I haven't got time to faff about, so I'm just going to do that. So based on Pentium 2 not working out, I mean it's 100 megahertz CPU. I'm going to go with the Coppermine 850. So this is going to be a bit more kick-ass than I originally thought. Certainly going to get the most out of that Voodoo 2. And should be able to play some more games than I was originally expecting. Nice. Well, damn. Replacing the power supply worked for a bit, but no longer than the previous power supply worked for, so I guess that one's fine. It's just power cycling itself. So the CPU has changed, the power supply has changed, the power feed is good. So I think we've got a motherboard problem. This is exactly the kind of problem I did not want to have. Okay, so I'm going to have to go with the MSI board with the Apollo Plus chipset with built-in audio, with a terrible FM but fine wavetable. Also means I can still use the Voodoo 2 because I don't need to install the sound card. But I can still keep the networking, so I've got enough slots for that. I can use the same RAM. I nearly forgot that it does mean I'm going to have to replace this one dodgy cap. So the one that's come out is 1500 microfarad at 10 volts. So I'm just going to upgrade it to 16 volts, but keep the capacitance the same and use a nice Nichicon one. I-O, to find the shield I go. Turns out I've got like 5 of these ones, so I'll pick a nice shiny one. So the power mystery has returned. There I was making my breakfast, To my surprise, I heard a beep from the corner of the room. It can only be the power switch, right? Because it's unresponsive at times, and I think just the conductors have broken down inside and they're just making intermittent contact. Because it had been doing it all night. It was warm. So at least that explains the issue. After replacing everything else, it was this thing, of course. Okay, I've switched to the LCD for reasons of flicker, and I'm getting nothing but grief from this system. Nothing will run in 3D. Even if I run the basic DirectX diagnostics, I'm getting just a crash. So if I run the Direct 3D test hardware, so that's just quit the program, crash to the desktop before I was getting a blue screen. Also, I've had to take out the Voodoo card because it won't run anything in 3DFX mode either. So I'm thinking the chipset is to blame, which means I have to swap out the motherboard again. So the VIA Apollo Plus is notoriously unreliable. Going to go back to the Supermicro and try that instead and see if it clears things up a bit. Right, let's see if it was the chipset all along. It was. Wow, VIA is trash. I mean, I know Intel really had the only good AGP implementation for a long time. BX is best, especially when you're going for slot 1. Supermicro is even better. So I've remembered something. I was going to go with the Voodoo 2 for this computer because 1998, but given that we've got the faster CPU in there now and how long the BX chipset lasted, this could be a 99 system. That means that I could have the Dream Team. Now, some of you may recognize this card because it's a Creative Labs card which followed the NVIDIA reference design for this chipset, which is the GeForce256, which is one of the most famous graphics cards of all time because it was the first proper GPU offloading transform and lighting effects onto the silicon on the card instead of on the CPU. So that means I can play DirectX games and Voodoo 2 games, well, just Voodoo games generally. And that is really the best of both worlds. And this is a situation that really was only relevant last in kind of 99, 2000, maybe when the Voodoo 3 came out as well. So I'm going to give this a go. Maybe they will play nice together. So far so good. Let's see what 3D Mark can do with it. Okay, we've got the GeForce256 on the left and the Voodoo 2 on the right. The visuals produced by both cards look amazing, with the only discernible difference being the frame rate. The GeForce is providing 60 plus FPS, more than double the performance of the Voodoo card that's only a year older. One thing we see consistently borne out in these kind of tests is that the graphical quality and performance of the Voodoo 2 was second to none in terms of gaming at the time it came out. This is largely because there wasn't much of a gap between PCI and AGP graphics cards at first, but by the time the GeForce had come out, however, that gap had widened significantly. Still, you would be hard pressed to spot the difference without a frame counter in some cases. So the Voodoo 2 gets 2,505 3D marks compared to the 6,194 of the GeForce. I know it's a synthetic benchmark, so its use is limited, but the idea that you could gain 40% gaming performance just by upgrading your graphics card was mind-blowing in 1999. The best part of that upgrade though is that you can still play all your favourite 3DFX games and have access to the latest greatest titles as well. One particularly cool aspect of the GeForce Installer CD is that it includes a bunch of tech demos, including this mirror ball in someone's back garden or flying through an intestine, and there's a particle demo and some pretty reflections, but most impressively this tree where you can use sliders to alter every feature in real time. And then there's Wander, allowing you to render a humanoid in various forms.
Where's the naked option?
Shut up, Nigel. Now we get to the really important bit, games. Some of these are 3D effects games, and some of them are DirectX games that were a bit later, sort of 1999, so they would fit the GeForce 256, and some of them fit the Voodoo 2. First up, X-Wing Alliance. I was curious to see how each card performed, and apart from higher resolutions being available with the GeForce, I couldn't tell any difference whatsoever between it and the Voodoo 2, and I played it for a while.
Good morning, and welcome to the Black Mesa Transit.
Although Half-Life from late 1998 doesn't support Voodoo graphics directly, I was curious to see if there was any difference between rendering in DirectX and OpenGL. They look pretty identical on the surface. But one thing that definitely helped NVIDIA out was their driver support, as many earlier cards really suffered with terrible drivers, leading to instability and poor rendering, particularly in games like this.
The Black Mesa
Sports Car GT performs perfectly and was a pretty demanding game for 1999, so the GeForce 256 really was the card to have for high-res 3D texture mapped gaming at the time. Ah yes, the obligatory full motion video intro. Rally Championship is an equally demanding game from late 1999, which I seem to remember my TNT2 Vanta struggling with at high detail back in the day. Again though, there really isn't much to call between the two cards. The reflections look great, smoke looks like smoke, and it flies along with very little effort. One of my favourite games from 1999 has to be Aliens vs Predator, which will never not be terrifying. I mean, the film itself was bad enough, but to be thrown into that environment personally, no thanks, but also yes please. This is one of those games that was really only possible with more advanced lighting effects. I had to do a comparison of both cards in Unreal Tournament, mostly because it has a handy built-in benchmark, and I wanted to see just how many lies 3D Mark had been telling earlier. Running both at 800x600 in 16-bit colour, the GeForce under DirectX produced 47 FPS, while the Voodoo 2 really wasn't far behind with 39.5. I would not be unhappy in '99 with a year-old graphics card giving me 40 FPS. In day-to-day gaming, NVIDIA's card brought you true 32-bit colour and high resolutions, but not necessarily a better all-round experience. Another classic from the time is Kingpin Life of Crime, a trailblazer of a game featuring cinematic cutscenes and the kind of violence and profanity that wasn't considered usual in a game until GTA 3 came along 2 years later. In addition to that, it had a soundtrack from Cypress Hill for extra kudos, and the whole thing was rendered using the Quake 2 engine. And finally GTA 2, which I saw as essentially a graphical overhaul of the original game, still using the same mission format and top-down view, but it's still an awesome game, even though I never actually completed it. There were some other favourites that I really wanted to share, like Motorhead, Roll Cage Stage 2 and Swift 3D, but I just couldn't get them working probably down to a driver issue, so maybe we'll revisit those another time. Well, I don't know about you, I've definitely had a party. Building this system has been fantastic. It closely matches the computer that I had in about 2000, except the graphics card was much better. So the games, all the games that I played back then that weren't quite up to standard, like Grand Prix 3, Alien vs Predator, some of them were intense games, I just couldn't play those as they were meant to be. So it's been fantastic to go back, just like with my 486 build, and experience things better than I did back then.